is that because of the whole idea of Quesada basically looking around and doing this huge reshuffling of the entire Marvel landscape, there were a whole bunch of events that were unfolding at around the same time. Within 3 years, you basically had Avengers Disassembled, House of M, Civil War, just all these events that took place. But Avengers Disassembled was designed to do exactly what it sounds like, disassemble the Avengers, to bring the team to an end. And then Marvel relaunched the Avengers with the new Avengers line of comics. Now the difference here was that it was basically an entirely new and updated roster. And it basically consisted of Spider-Woman and Captain America and Iron Man, Spider-Man and Wolverine.
Yes, sir. That shit is tough.
In order to understand this story.
Yes,
but again,
sir.
I
They got
have a
this.
video. I think I have a couple
The
of
Infinity
videos on
War
like the
John
original
and
Century
John.
story.
Okay, I want it
like
too,
my
but you
favorite comic book
play
story
nobody
of all
else
time.
except
Like
for
I
Punisher.
love the way it's written.
Not
I
even
love the way
him,
it's done.
and
It's so
Jeff.
fascinating to me.
You're about to
Essentially
buy a
picks up
skin
into
for
that.
somebody.
I'm not. I just wanted to
Comes out
see
of
the skin. It's my
fallout
first time
from
seeing
the
it.
first
Oh,
story
why
of
did
the
they
Avengers.
buy?
No, it's true. We could have
I
covered
had
that, but I just chose not to, just because of the fact that with regards to the
Yes,
Century, he
sir.
just kind of popped up. He was just there.
It's
And the
a
whole
good
idea of the first
animation.
story arc is it was basically called Breakout, and it was essentially this scenario where Electro had been contracted
This is
to
a
go
good
into
animation. What the
raft,
fuck?
which is a
And it
prison
keeps.
for all these
Okay,
various
if it kept
supervillains,
going, that
and
shit
then
would have been
shut the
sweet.
power down to the raft, allowing everybody
some
to escape.
good
And there were
ass
some cool
sketch.
moments, you know, like when Purple Man seized
I
control.
don't get this if I was a Captain
and
America.
tried to make him kill Jessica Jones and kill the
That's
other
right.
Avengers. But with regards to the Century, he just kind of popped up onto
Yeah,
the
Captain
scene. He
America
grabbed
got
Carnage,
better.
flew into space, ripped him in half, and then disappeared.
I hate
And
Captain
that was it.
America.
It was a way for Marvel to say, like, he's here now, and then follow up with this story arc, which basically gives us an explanation of what's going on with him. But again, the idea of the Century being here is that it's really the Avengers trying to figure out who he is, trying to understand what he's about. And it's kind of interesting because what they end up doing is bringing his wife Lindy in. Now, of course, Lindy was basically was a character from the original miniseries. The idea of the original miniseries was that the Century was kind of, at least it seemed like he was suffering from schizophrenia / multiple personality disorder. So not only did he seem to have two personalities in the form of Robert Reynolds, maybe even three in terms of like Robert Reynolds, the Century, and the Void, but it was also schizophrenia in the sense that he didn't know what was real and what was false. But the idea is that when they try to initially sit down and say, hey, look, like, we're trying to figure out who you're about, they bring in Lindy, and then they bring in Paul Jenkins. And that's kind of the funny thing about this, is because Paul Jenkins wrote the original story. And the way that Bendis does this is really kind of intriguing here. What he basically comes along and he says is that Paul Jenkins wrote comics about the Century. Like, he basically created the character seemingly out of nowhere. The idea that this guy, Robert Reynolds, acting as the Century is around creates a little bit of confusion because no one knows who he is and no one knows where he comes from. They just simply know that, like, he's there. Basically, what this indicates is that the characters that Paul Jenkins created have somehow come to life in the Marvel Universe, that they're walking around, even though they
Yeah,
really
beef is
shouldn't be.
always a
But
good
what ends up
bulk.
happening here is
Beef
the
and
superhero kind of
beef
reach
and
out to
potatoes.
say, look, you guys are
Because that's
all
starch,
doomed. The Void is coming, like,
which
you
is
guys
gonna
are
give
all
you
screwed. You have
carbohydrates,
no
which is
idea how
gonna,
bad you're screwed.
which is
And then
protein,
basically just
anyways.
kind of takes off. But from here, it jumps to Robert Reynolds just kind of sitting in his home. Now, this is harkening back to the early days, to the original miniseries, because the way it originally picked up, Robert Reynolds was just like a guy who was there inside of his house, and the Void would visit him, quote unquote, and the Void would like whisper things to him and say things like, you're all gonna die, you know, and, you know, I'm coming back, and you've doomed humanity, and so on and so forth. In the original miniseries, he believed his dog was the Void and was talking to him and struck the dog, so his wife freaked out and left because she couldn't handle his episodes anymore. But it was very much borderline on like what in the world was going on. Is any of this true? Is any of this false? It was really kind of cool in terms of how that happened. But in the middle of all this, basically Robert Reynolds is met with a psychic projection of Emma Frost. And this is when we start to learn how bad things are. Because when it comes to like the superhero community in Marvel Comics, S.H.I.E.L.D. is very much like a monitor of Earth. They keep an eye on Earth and everything that's going on. The fact that the Century has existed was basically stuck in the raft. No one knew who he was. No one knew how he got there. And he had this incredible amount of power, really put S.H.I.E.L.D. in a panic mode, because the question was, how could we not know this? Like, how could we not be aware this guy existed? And so in response, what's happened is the new Avengers have basically assembled the veritable who's who of like the superhero community. Basically, some of the X-Men, not really all of them, basically like a handful of them, alongside like all of the new Avengers themselves, a full S.H.I.E.L.D. contingent, as well as the Inhumans, the Fantastic Four, Doctor Strange, basically everybody's here. Now, this is Bendis kind of putting the Century on display. Here's the kind of power we're dealing with. If it was a person who was just of like passing curiosity, then it would have just probably been like Captain America and Iron Man, who would have just like knocked on his door, and they would have had some coffee and sat down for a friendly chat. But like the heavy hitters of the superhero community in Marvel Comics showing up here and basically being like, we have to figure out what's going on. It's pretty intense, because